Good evening, everyone. We'll get started. I'm sure people will still be coming through from the bar as we go. So this evening we've got 2 parts: the offshore crew work, which is going to be presented by Drew, and the second part is going to be sort of an introduction to the navigation. There's a huge topic in itself, but in terms of the navigation and the software, Laura's going to speak a little about that. And what we're going to say with that one is, if this is something you are interested in, you know, like to spend more time, then we'll try and organise that with Laura and maybe a few other people that are knowledgeable of the system. So it's really just to give you a taste of tonight. So our intention really is to try and go all the way through with both those without a break, depending how many questions come up for Drew, and that way we can get finished, you know, just over an hour. Anyway, so we'll start off with Drew.
Okay, ask questions as we're going along, please. Right, I think one of the things that people sometimes don't realise is that going offshore is a slightly different concept than racing around the canyons. It's more of a stamina event, and also it's somewhere where you really need to drive for speed all the time. So this talk is not necessarily... See, I'll copy that up already. This talk is not necessarily about tiny wee tips. There'll be a few of them, but it's more about just getting the crew and the mentality of the crew together for a trip, and in this case, San Fernando. So I think the key is everyone goes on these offshore races for different reasons. Sorry. And I think one of the best keys, before everyone gets frustrated because they're not getting what they want out of a race, is to work out what your goals for the actual race is. Now that's either to win the race, obviously, which is what a lot of us are in there for, or win a division, and Hong Kong's fantastic at having a million different divisions, or finding particular competitors that you have that you really want to beat. Some people are just there to get there, and then obviously the Moon Blues and the like, which is one on the first page, thank you Richard, is to catch the biggest fish.
Absolutely.
I think you really want buy-in from everyone on board in terms of what those goals should be, and then within the boat, you know, you try and get a little bit of competition going. You know, which watch has the highest average speed, who got the highest speed, all of that sort of stuff. So you try and bring the crew together to achieve whatever goal it is that you've decided that you want to chase. Oh, Jesus. Okay, now Lauren will talk a wee bit more about navigation specifically, but typically we find on the boats that we sail that the navigator, and I'm using the word navigator here, you can call it tactician or strategist or whatever else you want to call it, but there needs to be one person on the boat that's got the full game plan in their head and is trying to bring everyone else into achieving that game plan. And so I think one of the key things before you leave the dock is to give everyone a briefing in terms of weather, in terms of the course, in terms of what to expect, in terms of, and Lauren again will talk about courses and polars and grid files and whatnot. But what overall for the next 3 days you're expecting when you're going down to San Fernando or Hobart or wherever you're going. And then within that, the navigator really should be updating everyone at the beginning of every watch. The weather's a big thing. Now here it tends to be fairly predictable. You're going to get a 2-sail reach and then you're going to have nothing. But in something like the Hobart, you've got a rolling set of weather systems that come through, and every watch needs to have the parameters in which they should be looking out for and what they're aiming to do in the next 4 hours or 6 hours or whatever you're talking about. In terms of Asia, I think the keys are particularly thunderstorms. On the way to Hainan last year, we got caught under a thunderstorm for a couple of hours and went nowhere where everyone else was shooting off. I think changes in the wind direction, and particularly if they don't tie in with what the navigator's expecting, you've got to have an idea of why that's happening and how you change the boat setup and the course for that. And as you get into the Philippines, the thermal breezes are going to be really key. The other thing is, as you're driving and trimming a boat in your 4 hours while a navigator's snoring, is to understand exactly what the goals the navigator wants you to achieve. Whether you want to be above the run line, below the run line, you know, above the run line and then changing because there's going to be a wind shift. Have in your mind when you're sailing your 4 hours exactly what is going to come up and how you're going to react to that. And then, particularly if you're flying shy kites, which happens a lot in these races up here, are you better off to soak off, or does the navigator, for whatever tactical reason, really want you to jam up high to hit the coast earlier? You know, where in the game plan are you trying to achieve in those 4 hours? And that is particularly key in terms of weather, in terms of sail changes and whatnot. And so, every time you go and watch, you should have a little game plan, and you should treat each watch as a little race in itself. And then, principally as a crew morale, one way or the other, you should actually have the navigator coming up at each sked and giving you a really good idea of where everyone sits on the race course, particularly the boats you're interested in, whether that's winning the race or the boats you want to beat particularly. And that sort of keeps you on your toes as a sort of scorecard. And so in the old days, what we used to have is a huge laminated chart stuck together and use Chinagraph pencils to highlight where everyone is, so the whole crew has a good idea of where the rest of the race course, or where the rest of the fleet is on the race course. Or in this day and age, often it works really quite well on an iPad. And if you don't have navionics on your iPad, buy it. It's the cheapest money you can spend. And they do work once you're out of range because the GPS still works. And you can plot people on that really quite easily, and it's a great way of showing everyone on board, you know, where the fleet is at any particular stage. And then obviously within that, you then need to start working out how you attack or how you defend against those people in the fleet, with the overall idea of where you're expecting the weather to come from. The navigator in particular, I think, should not be part of the watch system, but be above and beyond that. Okay. So what I've done here is used ambush as a wee example. We usually go offshore with 9. And how you set up the crew within those 9 people. Typically you need 2 foredecks, and those 2 foredecks should really talk to each other a lot. The worst thing you can do is, and it happens a lot, is the new foredeck comes on at dusk and has no idea where his halyards are, and you end up not being able to change sails, or change them very slowly, or the foredeck gets his torch out and blinds everyone else on board. Or that will happen anyway, so you may as well get used to that. You also should have on each watch really a primary trimmer, right? And that person ends up being, if you like, the boat speed Nazi, and they should really drive the drivers. So if you're off your targets, and again Lauren will talk about polars, if you're off your targets, they really should be beating up on the drivers. And then you should have 2 B trimmers, which if you're running or reaching will typically sit on the main, and generally work hard around the boat. And then you should have a driver, an A driver on each watch. And we'll talk a wee bit more about what those A drivers need to do. But those drivers should also be helping the navigator working out the strategy as you go down the course. Talked about the floating navigator. I think one of the things that is very important is that everyone on board should always know where the ropes are in the pit, because that is the number one thing that you have to jump into to fill when you're suddenly doing a sail change, or when you have to pull a kite that's in pieces down, or, should it never happen, when someone goes overboard.
So you're talking about two watch system here, are you?
Two watch system, yeah.
Right. I mean, in your experience, can rolling watch systems be good on shorter races, longer races? Or?
They can if you've got enough people. But if you think about most boats, you really need, if you're running or reaching hard, you need 5 people on deck. And so to have 3 watches, you're sort of talking about 15. But we'll talk about watch systems in a minute. Okay. I think the other key point here, and particularly in a race like the San Fernando, is to really play to your strengths. Right? You know, some of the heavier boats will do better out of Hong Kong in the first couple of days when you really got some decent breeze. You know, the classic example here is that, you know, our boat Ambush is very good uphill, Signal 8's very good downhill, and you really have to play to your strengths and make sure that you're actually getting the most rating-wise out of your boat when you've got the conditions that you like. Generally, and again this will tie into the watch system, you've got to make the drivers and the trimmers work hardest when it makes the most difference. So at night, you really want your best guys on, particularly driving at night. In light, really light conditions, some people are great at driving in light conditions, some really good helmsmen are dreadful at driving in light conditions. And as we all know, you're going to get some. The A-team, whatever it may be on whatever boat, again you want to play to your strengths, so you want to rest them when you can. So moderate conditions during the day, and 2-sail reaching in particular, where it's pretty easy to drive and trim. When you want to rest the A-team and you're working the B-team a bit harder. And the fatal flaw that we all make is that when we're screaming downwind with the kite up and having a whale of a time, everyone's on deck, and then it gets nasty and everyone's knackered. So you've got to have the discipline to make sure that people get rest, even though it's the funnest bit of the race. And then we'll talk a wee bit more about the last day, but the last day is always where people start falling over. We're all fairly good at hanging out in Wanchai till 2 o'clock in the morning, but as soon as we get on a boat, everyone goes to sleep as soon as the sun goes down. So offshores are typically won at night. They're won by the crews that keep changing sails, that keep trimming, that keep working the boats hard. But in Asia in particular, you're typically in the lighter air scenario at night than you are during the day, which doubles up the difficulties of actually keeping the boat moving and moving quickly. So one of the number 1 rules we have is that you always got the biggest sails up that you possibly can, right? Because it's typically going to moderate, and you typically want to be stuck slightly overpowered and slightly underpowered. The other thing at night is when you get becalmed, everyone has a dummy spit and loses concentration. And if someone's doing 3 knots and you're doing 0 knots, they're getting a lot closer to the next weather system than you are. So particularly on heavy boats, and we found this in the Commodore's Cup in particular, get the drifter up sooner rather than later. And you can have the drifter up until about 6-7 knots of breeze, and on most heavy boats you'll still be doing better than getting into a number 1 or getting into a light tide. Particularly if you've got a bit of seaway, which you typically do have offshore. It's just a more stable sail, and it will keep the boat going a lot quicker. Now, having said that, I used to hate drifters, but I'm now convinced the other way. The other thing, particularly 2-sail reaching, is use all the sails you can. You know, staysails are really quick 2-sail reaching, jib tops, code zeros if you've got them. And really, this comes back into the navigator, work out your angles versus your speeds when you've got these other sails up. But staysails in particular are hugely underrated as a rule. And the other thing is if you are screaming along on the edge, which again happens quite a lot when you're tight reaching around this part of the world, focus not on the top speeds, but on the average speed. So if you're going to broach every half an hour, often it's quicker to drop down a sail and keep the boat on its feet than sit there for 5 minutes flapping around every half an hour. The other thing, of course, is that when you go offshore, everyone goes to sleep a bit, and it's actually quite hard to keep people focused. But everyone on board should be looking out, keeping their head out of the boat and seeing what's coming next. The navigator on the watch chain should highlight what may be coming up. You know, you should know when there's thunderstorms potentially coming through, thermal breezes coming through, and the foredecks and the B trimmers who've got the chance to have their heads out of the boat should be really focusing on that. In light airs, either stand on the boom or get on the first set of spreaders to have a look for breeze. Usually, particularly on heavier boats, doesn't have any impact on your boat speed, but it can make a huge impact on where you're going. We messed up the China Sea Race this year, was it? Last year. Last year. Yes, and last year. Because we went for the coast and we missed the thermals by 3 hours. Right, so if you're going to do things like going for thermals along the coast of the Philippines, really time your run so you hit the coast at the right time, and if you're not going to hit the coast, work out what you're going to do instead. We were flopping around for hours in between the gradient breeze and thermals. The boats that got there 3 or 4 hours ahead of us did really well, but we didn't. But again, keep an eye out for where you can see the thermals starting to develop, and particularly as you get close to the coast, looking at the smoke on the coast is a really good way of identifying. Smelling it is a really good way of identifying when those thermals are going to start kicking through. Tide, I think, is underrated in this part of the world, but certainly when we went to Taiwan a couple of years ago, the tidal changes and tidal differences were huge. Now, it's not quite so bad going to the Philippines, but again, there's not a lot of good tidal information in this part of the world. But again, the more you can get, the better you'll be, because particularly if you're doing 4 knots and you're pushing not a tide, that's 25% of your boat speed, and it's really quite slow. And vice versa, if you've got it with you, it can be a real winner. Talked about the thunderstorms. You don't get big changes in weather systems like you do in the Hobart, for example, up here, but they do happen. They do happen. When we did the first Vietnam race, Lou was sitting 1.5 miles further offshore to us. We saw the rolling cloud come down, jibed into it, and I think we put 20 miles on them in the space of 1.5 hours. And that was just a mild difference, and seeing the weather systems versus them, and that won us the race. So keep an eye out for weather systems. Okay, so we know we're talking about watch systems, right? On something like free fire, or the bigger boats, you can have a rolling 3-way system, and that actually works quite well because it's, I guess, the hybrid between what we're describing here and what we will describe next. The first option is the age-old option where you're 4 hours on, 4 hours off during the day, and 3 hours on, 3 hours off during the night. And the 3 hours on and off during the night, if you don't realise why, is A, because it's a shorter attention span, but B, it means that the dog watch changes every day. So that works quite well. On a boat of 9, you have 2 groups of 4, and it is good for older crew. It is good for people with less experience because it's a more uniform way of sailing your boat. It's much better for longer races. I mean, all the around the world boats run this sort of system, or a 3 system, and it does potentially, if you can work it well, get a bit of competition between the 2 watches, and competition's always good for keeping boat speed up. It's very bad for laziness, particularly if it's not particularly pleasant on deck, and no one really needs 12 hours sleep a day. But I have seen it happen more than once. It's also particularly bad for poor handovers, because everyone's knackered after 4 hours, particularly at night after 3 hours, and they just jump off watch, the new watch comes on, and it's Control-Alt-Delete, and it's all start again, and everyone has to learn about how the boat is operating. And the other big thing is that it reduces the idea flow between the whole crew, because you've got one group that are sailing the boat one way, the next group come up on deck, they sail the boat a different way, and it really has the potential for people, or for things to slip through the cracks. The other option, and you'll notice Jeff in his particularly attractive pattern, is to have a buddy system. And this can work really, really well, or really, really badly. What you do is you pair off each of those different roles that we discussed before. So your two foredecks pair off, your two drivers pair off, your two sets of trimmers pair off, and then they relieve each other as and when they need some rest. It does tend to mean people stay on deck longer, so they don't get the 12 hours skip that the 4 hour, 4 on, 4 hours on, 4 hours off thing tends to create. It's good for younger people with a bit more stamina, but you do have to be quite disciplined, because one of the big downsides of this is that everyone gets knackered by the last day if they're not disciplined about getting rest. It does keep the boat going because you've got a rolling group of people changing the whole time, and you get that idea interaction going that you wouldn't with the 4 hour on, 4 hour off thing. And it also means you can play to your strengths better. So if you've got a driver that's particularly good in the light or particularly good heavy air downhill, you can keep them going longer. And the other thing I think is trimmers. You know, some people are fantastic trimmers downhill, and you can keep them going longer as well. And so there isn't that uniform thing that everyone just goes, oh, it's 4 hours, got to go to bed. People are there to really drive the boat hard. It's really bad if someone gets crook or if someone's lazy, because the other buddy ends up destroying themselves, basically trying to lift the other guy. You can get very out of sync, and suddenly you've got no one on deck at 2 o'clock in the morning. And people do tend to run a lot harder into the last day, which in this part of the world is often where you need the concentration more than anywhere else.
Drew, one thing I'd say on that, you didn't really mention there, but you need, if you're doing that system, your two people that are buddied up need to talk to each other as well, because the person that's up on deck needs to be able to go and tell the other person that they're knackered or whatever.
Yeah, yeah. You can't be shy.
No.
You can't be shy. Drivers. We all love to drive, and we all love to drive particularly offshore. And you get a lot of arrowdite fingers out there. We've all seen them. I think there's a few things with the drivers. The first thing is have a proper handover. You know, you should have the new driver sitting behind the existing driver for 15 minutes before the handover, understanding, you know, what the wind's been doing, where it's been swinging through, understanding where the waves are coming from, particularly if you're going dead downhill. That's a classic way to go into a Chinese broach, where the wave comes from the windward quarter and suddenly you're swimming. The other thing is, you know, often the wind is cyclical. So, you know, what have you had up? What have you got up? How's the boat handling that? And what are you thinking about changing to? And so that, I think, is really quite important. Don't put the wrong people into high-risk manoeuvres, right? We did this on the way to Hainan, and I spent 2.5 hours up the rig cutting a spinnaker off our forestay, which was... Oh,
All right.
which was
Emotional.
very emotional. Thank you. Yes, it was a very nice spinnaker too. It was, and my legs took some time to recover as well. So that happened because, you know, the comment was, "Who wants to drive?" Someone stuck their hand up. They should have stuck their hand up in the first instance, but equally, you know, it was up to the guy that was handing the helm over to pick who should have taken over from him. And so I really think it's important, particularly when you're heavy air downhill, heavy air uphill, or light airs, that the existing driver picks who's going to go next. Right? And you should know after a day or so at sea who can do what. The A trimmer should be the speed Nazis. Thank you for changing that.
Makes more sense.
The trimmers are usually the best people to keep an eye on the helmsman. Right? They should understand what the target speeds are at any particular time. They should be right on the drivers, telling them if they're off speed. And they also, particularly at night, should be the ones that are suggesting that someone has a rest. Because it's very easy when you're driving to say, "Oh, it's another 15 minutes till the next bloke gets up, I'll just hang on." So the trimmers really should be on top of the helmsman all the time. The helmsmen, of course, hate this, but you know, they've got cushy jobs, so there's no point in prodding them. No harm in prodding them. The other thing I find that drivers, and I'm one of them, get stuck at, particularly if you've got big, bright 2020s on the mast, is you get mesmerised by the instruments. And if you are driving, it's often good to make sure that you're only looking at the instruments as little as possible. But if you are the trimmer sitting next to a guy and you can see him just starting to do this, right, make sure he's either starting to look up at the sky, look at the sails, or get off the helm. Because it is very, very hard when you're knackered not to focus too much on the instruments, or to focus too much on the instruments. And then drivers will have their pluses and minuses, right? You know, a guy that doesn't get to drive much, when he's two sail reaching, will love it and will concentrate really hard. Someone like me will get bored senseless with it and probably isn't doing a good enough job. But in heavy air, you know, I'm not bad, so you put me on for longer. And in the super light stuff, what you want is someone that just can concentrate and concentrate and concentrate. And that, again, particularly in the races we do around here, is really, really important. So you've really got to push the drivers to focus on spending the most time on the helm when they're in their zone. And the other thing is everyone wants a top speed, right? So when you're screaming downhill, you've got to rotate the drivers again, because that's where the araldite gets very sticky. And if someone gets tired, a broach or a wrapped spinnaker really doesn't make you go. Okay, and then the last day. I don't think I've ever been on an ocean race where there hasn't been a dummy split on the last day. It's usually me, of course. But everyone sort of smells the smoke of the Philippines, sees Tasman Island, and just stays up way too long, loses concentration, and gets very, very grumpy, and everything starts falling apart. So into the last day, you really got to manage everyone on the cruise sleep. Now, it's quite hard if it's really hot, particularly downstairs on some of these boats. But the drivers and the navigators really need to be in shape for that last bit into the Philippines, into Storm Bay, into Plymouth, whatever it is. You really need the guys on top form on that last day. Wind lookouts become really important on the Philippine coast, particularly if you are in close to the coast where you've got the wind coming out the valleys and the real holes around the headlands. And so trying to work out how far out the holes extend and so forth can really make or break your day. someone with good jokes is always very important on the last day. And particularly if they tell German jokes in our boat, it's also much the better. And then what we typically do is 20 or 30 miles out, when everyone needs to come up on deck and really make the last push, is make a little bit of an event out of it, right? So in the Sydney Hobart, as we go around Tasman, for some bizarre reason that no one can explain, that goes back to the 80s, we have smoked oysters on biscuits, which is the most ridiculous thing, but everyone looks forward to it. And you just need to make a little bit of an event out of when you're going to start the last push. Okay. One of the classic things at sea is everyone's like, oh yeah, the boat feels good, we're doing all right. But sail changes, again, are how you win and lose races. And you've got to keep doing them. You've got to appreciate your foredecks, but you can't feel sorry for them. So keep pushing them. Make sure the foredecks always know where their halyards are. I'll keep saying this because it is actually really, really important. Best way to get a bit of morale going is have the drivers go downstairs and pack a sail. Never happens, of course, but it does work quite well. The 5-minute rule, some people do a 10-minute rule, depends on how bad your sail changes are. But if the sail's out of range, give it 5 minutes, and if it's still out of its range, change it. Okay, if you want to extend that to 10 minutes, give it 10 minutes. But I am surprised even to this day how resistant people are to change sails. And the fact is we're out there to go yachting and yacht racing, so you've just got to keep changing. And part of that is knowing your course boundaries, right? How far below the run line or the target course, how far above can you actually go? And so it's very key that, particularly if you're marginal spinnaker reaching or your VMG running, that you know where you're allowed to play as a driver, right? Because you know, it's all very well to go shooting off at high speed, but if there's a hole that the navigator's trying to get you around and you've shot off into that hole, that really doesn't help anyone. So again, if you've got a plus or minus 10, stick to it unless there's a really good reason not to. Okay. All right, a couple of little tips. Bareheaded kite changes are okay, particularly at night, but for God's sake, make sure the next one's ready to go up. So it's got a halyard on it, it's got a change sheet on it, and all you need to do is put the new brace on and send it up once the other one's down. Bareheaded headsail changes. In the good old days when you never wore life harnesses doing Sydney Hobarts, we did a change from the fore to the storm jib, and it was blowing a wee bit. And I reckon I grabbed the forestay about 15 foot over the deck with no sail up, and that was quite scary. So it is dangerous to do bareheaded changes. Everyone thinks, oh, we'll just make it easy on the boys, but actually it's far more dangerous. It is also incredibly slow. Incredibly slow to do bareheaded. So even if you've got 4 guys on the foredeck battling with a headsail, it's still better than doing bareheaded. Reefing. No one ever reefs here. We've never reefed ambush. But particularly around this part of the world where it's squally, it's obvious. It's often a lot quicker to chuck a reef in and chuck it out as the squall goes through than it is to do a headsail change. So the biggest thing with reefing, apart from practice, which is pretty obvious, is to mark the main halyard, right? And to use for your tack the Cunningham, not one of those silly horns on your gooseneck. Because if you use a horn, right, you've got to drop the halyard and then grind it up again. If you use a Cunningham and you've got the halyard mark, you just drop the halyard, tighten on the Cunningham, and off you go. So the pit man can focus on pulling in the reef line. And so set your boat up like that, makes a huge difference, but mark the halyards. Particularly if your halyards downstairs, you can get one of the sleepers to roll out of their bunk, do it all, never gets wet. Really windy kite takedowns. If you're doing an A sail, the best thing to do is have a martin breaker, which is a piece of line that goes through the trip mechanism of the snap shackle. It's obviously got to be long enough so it doesn't snap all the time, but in that circumstance with an A sail, even in 30-40 knots, you can tie off the lazy sheet, blow the tack line, the clip will come undone, and suddenly you've got a flag, not a sail that you've got to pull in. And equally, I think with a symmetric kite, you know, actually pinging, you know, blowing the brace is a hell of a lot better in heavy air than trying to run the braces, particularly at night when no one's actually flaked out anything down below. And that are two big keys, I think, in terms of getting kites down safely. Cleating off the lazy brace or the lazy sheet, so if things do go bad, you've still got some way of getting the kite down, is often pretty useful as well.
Letterbox?
Letterboxes are good. Not so good if your foot's attached to the main, but for loose-footed mains, the letterboxes are good. Never use a front hatch. Right? Best thing to do is put your bow under a wave with an open front hatch. Takes you a wee while to get the water out. And everyone on board should have the pit memorised, because that's where you're going to have to jump quickest if you need to pull a sail down in a hurry. The other thing, of course, is that there was one Pedro Blanco race where some idiot owner jumped up on deck during a headsail change, during a spinnaker change, and dropped the wrong spinnaker in the water, and it wasn't a spinnaker by the time we got it out again. So that's known as a Drewski float. The marks on the halyards and flaking the halyards is also key. So you know you can have a laminated sheet like we do on ambush, which gives you every headsail setting in terms of the halyards, which just makes life a lot easier. Heavy air uphill. Again, people tend to be overpowered uphill because they don't want to change down. But focus on speed, right? You're going in the ocean, there is going to be a wind change at some stage, and unless you're trying to get around a headland or something, you know, you want speed, not height, right? Another key cocker on the racing boats in particular is that they leave everyone on the rail, because it's fast to have everyone on the rail, but really you've got to balance people's sleep with speed, right? So if you're not match racing someone down a coastline, you know, don't have everyone necessarily on the rail the whole time. Reefing on a lot of boats is just as good as reducing a headsail, and again, when you're coming into sort of thunderstorms and so forth where it's going to be fairly quick, it can often be a lot more effective than going to a 3 and then being back in the 2 20 minutes later. And also two-sail reaching, putting a reef in often balances a boat a lot better, particularly fractional lighter boats. And that is doubly the case, it appears, when you've got staysails on two-sail reaching. One of the things in Asia is that the waves are usually bigger than the wind conditions would suggest. And so there, you know, you want to go fast, you want fat sails, you want lots of twist, you don't want to be too cute on the trim and trying to get the last couple of degrees out of the boat. You want to go fast, and you want to keep the boat moving. And all of these things, of course, are more important at night than they are during the day. Heavy air downhill, drivers, pretty obvious. Trimmers, I think, underrated downhill. A really good trimmer can keep a boat on its feet a hell of a lot better than someone that's just hanging onto the sheet half asleep. You are going to broach, probably. So work out how to get out of it pretty quickly, and the best way to get out of it is to have a staysail up. And in fact, particularly after our twist event on the way to Hainan, anything over 15 knots of breeze, we have a rule now on ambush that a staysail goes up downhill just to stop the twist, if not anything else. Hook on. Right, everyone hooks on when it's really nasty on the nose, and no one does when it's screaming downhill. But if you broach downhill and you end up at the back of the boat's probably still doing 10 knots, and it's got a kite up. It's a bloody lot more difficult to come back and pick you up at 10 knots with a spinnaker up than at 6 knots with a jib up. So I think that's one of the things that people tend to underestimate. So hook on. The other thing about hooking on, if you are sitting somewhere, try and shorten the length of the tether, because a number of times I've seen people fly through the air and then get caught by the tether and face plant a winch is more than once. So some of the harnesses have short lines on them as well, but if not, just wrap the excess length around a winch or something, and you won't go far. Someone on the bang's pretty obvious. The other thing, if your traveller works well, the easiest way to dump a main often is to have the traveller over halfway up and then blow it as your first course of action, because the main will go out quicker if the traveller works well than it will just easing the sheet. So if you are on the edge, that's not a bad one. Backstay on. We won't mention free fire at the moment. And practice S-jives. The biggest thing you get caught on heavy air jibing is the boom not coming across. So if you are jibing in a heap of breeze, try and get the boat accelerated down a wave. Go well onto the new jibe as you're going fast. Get the boom across, and then as the boom comes across, you bear away dead downhill again. And it'll depower the whole boat really quite well. But it's called an S-jibe because it is. But it is the best way to control a heavy air jibe. In terms of bareheading and tacking around in a heap of breeze, people do it, but the potential for cock-ups is pretty high on that as well. Getting in irons in 45 knots of breeze without a jib up is really quite a nasty experience as well. So I'd be very tempted to try and jibe, and if you're not going to, I'd try and get something up at the front of the boat. Otherwise, getting in irons is not good. Boat tidiness, water, right? We all go offshore. We've all spent fortunes on keeping our boats light, and they leak like bloody sieves, and you end up sailing around with 1.5 tons of water in the boat. So, tape hatches. We have a Velcro and a cloth cover over the main hatch that rolls up, which keeps a remarkable amount of water out. And Nigel will see you one if you need it. Make sure people are keeping the water out of the boat, you know, bailing, you know, whoever wants to win the man of the match, that's the easiest way of getting good points. But you'll be surprised how much water can get downstairs and stays downstairs for some time. If you've had a bad kite drop or something, there'll be a heap of water in the boat. So keep on top of that. Keep the boat clean before you go. Ant will tell you about the joys of going to Vietnam with ticks in your bunk cushions. Right, make sure that the boat, before you leave the dock, is in good nick. Getting food poisoning offshore isn't terribly pleasant either, right? So make sure you keep on top of things going rotten and chucking them out before you stick the dodgy sausage roll in your mouth and that's all over. Wet weather gear in the bilge is possibly the most soul-destroying moment of any offshore race. So try and have some system where you can hang them up. And typically with things like wet weather gear and crew bags, what I try and do is tie the wet weather gear and the harnesses to my crew bag, so it's all in one big mess. So at least when I find find it's all in one place, rather than belting around in the village looking for bits and pieces in the middle of the night. And that goes particularly hard. And food. Best way to win the man of the match. Keep feeding people, particularly coffee and tea. I think that is a focus. Cleaning, the bilge, packing sails, it's all got to be done. And those of us that don't have boat boys that we can whip into shape, it's something that everyone needs to muck in and really get on top of. There is nothing worse than calling for a sail change and sticking your head down the hatch and realising it's still in a mess on the cockpit, on the floor downstairs. It's very, very slow and it's rather irritating. In terms of people getting crook, apart from buying them sort of palapine patches and making sure they stick them on, if people are going to get crook, try and work out if it's going to take them out or whether they're just going to be crook and they're going to be able to work still. If they are going to be taken out, then you're going to have to work out how to rearrange your crew and your watch system to cover for them. We've done Hobarts where there's been 3 of us driving the boat for 36 hours because the rest of the crew have been in pieces. And so that isn't terribly fast. So if people are getting crook, just try and work out how best to cover for them and keep the thing going. But if they are really crook, particularly in the heat going into the Philippines, you've got to make sure they try and keep hydrated because it can get really quite nasty. And hospitals in San Fernando are not somewhere you want to end up in a hurry. So you've got to look after them a bit as well, and then you make sure they buy as much rum as humanly possible when you get there. And that is me.
Well done.
Any questions for Drew?
Just a quick one about having the staysail up and downwind. I didn't quite.
If you've got a staysail up downwind, right, and you either go by the lee and the kite tries to wrap around the forestay, or in our case got over eased and the guy went too deep. By having the staysail and the forestay that far apart, it's far, far harder for the kite to actually wrap around the forestay itself. If you haven't got a staysail, putting the number 4 up the foil will work quite well as well. Or having a halyard to a pad eye halfway down the foredeck will also work. It's not as good though. In the old days when everyone used to broach in the IOR days, they actually used to have netting that went up the foil to stop kite wraps. But it's very, very slow, it's very painful, and it's bloody expensive if that happens.
Thank you. Firstly, I'll make one observation. Some of the guys racing here don't have 18 pencils. They sort of have one.
Well, that's easy, you just pull it in and out, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. But what I would say is if you are rolling early, you will reef before you roll. It's always faster. I've done quite a lot offshore with this. You get a lot more stability out of the boat just by trying to use the main as a trim tab when you've got a big overlapping genoa. So as soon as you roll the sail up, the first third of it isn't a foil anymore. So that's a circumstance where you wouldn't do what you say, which is reef never. You would actually really reef before you roll. It stabilises it far faster.
Sorry, yep.
I was just saying, on those S-drives you're talking about, this is after you've taken the kite down, right?
No.
Do it with the kite up?
Yep. Especially do it with the kite up. Because the kite, if the pole's off the kite, it doesn't matter which jibe you're on, if the trimmer's got it relatively under control, and make sure your tweakers are down. Right? In fact, your tweakers should be down in heavy air running anyway. But if you keep the tweakers really down, oversheet the kite, you can roll the boat under the kite pretty easily, particularly as you're going that way. But if you need 3 guys to pull the main across, get 3 guys to pull the main across.
The thing with that, well, if you take the kite down, you're going to lose a massive amount of boat speed, and therefore the apparent wind will increase because you're moving slower and the wind's coming behind you. You want the boat moving as fast as you can when you do your jibe.
Yeah. And how fast do you actually make the turn?
you probably, I don't know, if you go into, you probably 170 as you come down the wave, you probably come to 165 or something. As soon as the boom is in the centre line, you're going back to 180. But it's more about when the boom unloads on the new jibe and getting it across, and then bearing the boat down as the boom's under pressure.
It's much like jibing a single-handed laser.
Yeah,
and you can practice that.
As you actually turn, yeah.
Yeah, it's all you read it by when the boom comes under pressure, right? And you don't want to do it too quick because then the boom goes screaming across and you're too high on the other jibe.
Thanks, Drew.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you very much. So we're going to...
One last one. You're just talking about the crew condition in offshore races, but one way to avoid problems is to know your crew before you go offshore by doing enough training and go to Pedro Blanco as a training before the race starts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Makes a huge difference.
So you know the plus points and the weak points of each.
Yeah,
With everybody.
in theory.
Thank you very much, Drew. So, Lauren.
I don't know how many of you guys do navigation on a regular basis, but in my experience, a lot of people would like to get into it and have an interest. And things like navionics make it much easier for people to just tap into it and drop into it these days. But there are some amazing programs out there which are specifically about looking at navigation and tactics in depth, and they're really very powerful programs. So, how do I do this?
Point at the...
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, Gaston will be your...
What do you think?
So two of the biggest navigation programs that are out there are Deckman and Expedition. There's loads, but these are two of the biggest ones and probably the best known. So Deckman came first and was developed in sort of the mid-1980s, and Expedition, which is the one that I use most, and a lot of the race boats are sort of moving over to it these days. So we're going to focus on it this evening. That was developed in the early 2000s by Volvo navigator Nick White and Peter Visser. And I think they developed it for the 2001-2002 Volvo race when they were all on the Team News Corp boat together. So since they originally made the program, it's been used at Volvo America's Cup, like all top level races, and it's filtered down, and now you get obviously very serious race teams, but also club level teams using it more and more. So I think it's something that's really worth having a play around with, particularly if someone on your boat has got it on their laptop. Just pick it up, have a look. It's actually not as complicated as people sometimes make out. Like everyone thinks that navigation is a bit of a dark art, but if you just have a go and keep practicing, it's not that difficult. My next page, please. So typically when you get on the boat on a Saturday or a Sunday, the navigator will go downstairs and fire up the laptop and then not really be seen until sort of 15 minutes before the start or something like that. But this is typically what they'll be seeing on the laptop screen or their iPad, whichever one they're using. This is a screen grab from Expedition, the main website, so that's part of a chart from somewhere in New Zealand. I'm sorry I couldn't bring along a live, an actual program this evening to talk you guys through it, because that would have been better, but hopefully the screen grabs will give you an idea. So this basically is the home page effectively when you open Expedition. The GPS will locate your boat here and follow you around the course, so you can set it to display your track as well, which is what that black line is. The further along you go, it'll follow your track obviously, so you can actually see where your tacks are and your course around the race. The green dot at the top is their windward mark, and when it's green with the ley lines coming off it, that means it's the active mark. And you can drop your whole race in, obviously, before you start, so that you know where you're going. And a non-active mark will look something like that, just as a black dot. When you then use you use left, right, up and down to move on to your next marks, actually in this tab here in marks, and that will make it active. And when you do that, all of your instruments here, which are being read off your electric system, whether you're using B&G or Nexus or instruments like that, it all reads here. And so the program is pulling all the information from the instruments around your boat into this one package and showing you on the chart like this. Expedition's really good because it will scan around the charts, or you can set it to follow you around the course effectively. Can I have the next slide, please? So one of the basic things that we'll just cover this evening is polars. I don't know how many of you guys have looked at polars before, but effectively a polar shows the speed potential or your speed target at any given sail, any point of sail. And you can get your polars, particularly for the big boats. I think every good big race boat has got a set of polars. You can get it from the boat designer or the class association. Sometimes sail-making websites have got an extensive list of polars for popular classes as well. I know that North Sails has got quite a few. And also you can develop and refine your own polars. So if you're running a program like this, and your instruments are recording your boat speed and your wind angle all day, you can be really nerdy and analyse it at home in the evenings and develop your own polars over time. And to be honest, most of the serious race teams do actually do that. They're always refining and sort of evolving their polars. Polars obviously are great for navigators when you're planning an offshore race because you need to know what your targets are, and they can sort of help you achieve much higher speeds over the whole course if you know what you actually can achieve on a regular basis. So this is what a polar would look like in expedition. You can see from the tabs at the top there's nav, performance, start, heel. You can record so much data, frankly, in expedition. You can keep refining these polars for different types of racing that you're doing. So you'd have a set of polars for your start condition. This one's looking at performance polars. So you've got your wind speed here and your true wind angle, and then this is your boat speed target. So this is for a par 40. So you can see that at 25 knots and 30 degrees going upwind, they should be doing 5.33 knots. That's their target. So as Drew was saying, when you're offshore and you're the navigator, you'd be using your polars like this and constantly briefing your crew about, well, our target boat speed is X and we're only doing 80% or whatever. So, you know, we should be going a lot faster or something like that. And the more accurate your polars, obviously, the more you can fine-tune that. Sometimes when you've got a new boat, the polars will turn up and it looks like you're doing great because you're achieving 96% of your polars or something like that all the time from the beginning. But I think that's mostly because teams need to keep evolving their polars, and sometimes people don't realise how much you can actually tweak them. You really have to keep looking at your data every time you go racing. And this is the same information but visually. And as a navigator as well, once you get to know your boat really well and you're used to sort of playing around with data, you can edit both versions actually, and keep tweaking your speed so that you can get it really, really accurate. And obviously, if you've got a regular team, keep pushing the speed. This is another way of looking at polar. This takes your sail inventory into account. So again, you've got this is for a par 40 again. You've got your wind angle at the top and speed going down the side. So if you were on your way down to San Fernando and you were the navigator and you knew in advance that you were likely to have, say, 10 knots or something like that, and you were going to be doing 155 degrees or something like that, you'd be well into your A1 territory. So it's just a different way of considering the same information we looked at on the other chart. Quite a lot of people prefer this one, obviously, because it's so easy to use. It's really very visual. Expedition also has a function in it which, if you have accurate polars and you've got your sail inventory plugged in like this, when you run an optimal route, which we'll look at in a minute, it will tell you that at 10 o'clock at night you are likely to be needing your A1 or your A2 or something like that. You can make sail changes be slightly more forecast in advance, and means you can set your crew up ready for those changes. So this is what you're trying to achieve before your race. This is an optimal route, so you can sit in the yacht club before the start of San Fernando and say, this is what we anticipate the race will look like. Expedition will generate this, but it needs three kind of key things to be able to do it. The first one is the sail inventory, which we just looked at, that chart. You need to know which sails you're taking, what angle and what weather conditions you'll use them in. You need as much weather and tidal information as you can, particularly if you've never been down to that area before, so you don't really know what you're going to be facing. It is a bit harder in Asia because generally there isn't that much accurate information or sort of really good sources that you can go to, but if you look, it is there. If you're racing in Europe or the US, there's heaps of sources.
Can I just add one thing there?
Yes?
One thing that's very good around here, which I think you can get from Tide Tech, is you can get a map of sea surface temperatures,
Yeah.
which you can then extend in time over the race, because it's not a forecast, it's what it was. Those sea surface temperatures, Tide Tech produce a likely plot of current flows at the sea surface. Some of the flows in the China Sea, which are are about 2.5 knots. So if you've got a planing boat going downwind, you don't care. If you've got a slow boat that slugs through it, Expedition will take that into account and avoid the currents, which is an interesting trick.
Also, if you have a course like this plotted out before you go, it's also then cross-referencing it whilst you're out there and saying, are we actually experiencing this? Because I did the San Fernando a couple of years ago and I did use the sea temperature function, and although it was very accurate for the first half of the race, the second half of the race we actually found we had current against us, and I think it's because local conditions, that kind of thing. But as you say, there's a lot of historical data, so it is worth sort of taking that into account. So the two things we needed was weather information and tidal. So we're assuming we've got our sail inventory. This is a typical weather grid. A lot of race committees will say that you can only, it's in the sailing instructions, so you're only allowed to use weather information that's publicly available to everybody so that it's fair and no one's got an advantage over another team. Luckily there are tons of publicly available weather sources, and you can get a grid file from them. So a grid is a gridded binary. It's generally like this. It's a mathematically formatted weather forecast used in meteorology. So some of the best free weather grids that I've used, and Simon, you've probably got some more to add to these, I think, are Sail Docs, MyGrid, Mailer Sail, and this screenshot's actually from UGrid, and it's of the UK, not Hong Kong, but it's generally pretty reliable here.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I believe, anyone here from Salcom? Oh yeah, Castle. I believe the situation is here is that we permit subscription weather services to be downloaded during the race, but not tailored weather services.
Right, okay. Yeah.
So you can get predict wind. One thing I'll say about the paid services is you get a 1 kilometre resolution file.
Yeah.
This file is the 60 kilometre resolution file, and that's why it's free.
Yeah.
1 kilometre is wildly more accurate.
Yes. So as Simon was saying, when you go to a weather site, for instance, Sail Docs, you know the area you're going to be sailing in, for instance, Hong Kong to San Fernando, and the lat long of that area. And so you can request, as Simon was saying, at sort of different resolutions, a forecast. So you could zoom right into 1 kilometre, or this one obviously is at 60 kilometres. When it is then emailed to you, and you open it up in Expedition, it will look something like this. It will be closer in because obviously this isn't the whole English Channel, and you'll be looking at a much smaller area. But the reason we're looking at this is just to look at some of the real basics of what you'll see on the weather grid. So wind is drawn using the barbs that you can see over the whole chart. The more flecks you've got coming off the back of each barb, the windier it is. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is it 5 knots for every fleck? 10.
5 from the sharp.
And your surface pressure.
I believe Expedition uses a display of a force of wind for every half bar.
Let's say that again.
A force of wind for every half a bar.
Okay.
The observatory here uses 10 kilometres an hour for every full bar, I think. It's a bizarre reason.
Okay, so there's your wind barbs there. Your surface pressure is drawn on as well. I don't know how much everybody knows about highs and lows, but for your high pressure areas, for your low pressure areas like here, you see the contour lines getting closer together, and then where you've got your light winds, the contour lines get further apart. And obviously because it's the English Channel, there's rain, and that's drawn on with the shading there. So. The next thing that we needed to do to get an optimal route generated by Expedition was to have a tidal or current route. Again, these are also available for free online, and I don't know what the deal is for San Fernando with regards to having publicly available information, but is it the same?
Again, if it's a subscription and not tailored,
Yeah.
I believe you're allowed to go get it.
Okay.
So, if you weren't, ask Alex.
Yeah, check the sailing instructions. two of the ones that I've used extensively, particularly in Europe, is Winning Tides. It's absolutely fantastic. The English Channel, obviously, there's a lot of races going on around there. So if you're doing racing in Europe, I recommend the Winning Tides bolt-on for your expedition software. It's really good value for money. And Tide Tech is the other one. So you'll get a grid file similar to the one over here, and that will show you the current. That's a channel where the dark red colour is deeper water, and the channel's running. The current, is running much faster, and you can see the direction that it's going in. So you take these two grids in expedition, and the software will calculate your optimal route by taking all of this information into account. So this is a screen grab from expedition. You can select your area, the resolution that you want, the time that you want as well, and load it straight into expedition. Using the weather panel, so from that front home screen that we looked at with the tabs at the top, this is the weather panel, and navigators will be using this a lot in the run-up to the start of an offshore race. So Expedition has taken the wind and the current files, merged them together to give you your ideal route between, in this case, Hong Kong and San Fernando. And using the options up here, you can, where it says animate, you can have an animated view of your race. So if you've selected a 24 or 36 hour weather and tide grid and it's merged the two together, you can basically play through your race on an hour by hour basis and see how the weather and the tide develops and how that's going to affect your overall game plan. And it means that before the start of a big race, you'll probably, as the navigator or the tactician, be meeting up a lot to run these grids on a sort of daily basis, and by the time you get to the start of a race, you've got a really good idea of what's happened in the week before you started and what you can expect to happen whilst you're at sea. This is just a screen grab of how you would load those grid files. So in settings, it's pretty basic. This would be a lot easier if we're doing it in a small classroom live on Expedition, but it's a little bit like, it's just like loading a file on a normal computer, so you select the grid that you want. The other thing that Expedition can do is that it's powerful enough that it can take several grids and actually merge them all together. So if you didn't trust Mail a Sail or Sail Docs, you could take both of them in Expedition, take an average of all the different weather groups that you're using and spit out a course based on multiple sources, which is really useful. So again, this is the main tab menu at the top. We were on weather a second ago. We've gone into optimal now, and so we'll just skip through this quite quickly because again, if you guys have got specific questions, I can show you on a real computer in Expedition rather than using screen grabs. But just some of the things I thought would be interesting to point out. This is Ensemble, which is where I was just saying the multiple sources for weather group files. And Fleet, you can also monitor where the other boats that you're racing are, particularly if you've got their handicap or their polars. You need to have those logged in beforehand. But if you do have that, when they report their position on the skid, you can run a course and see how they're doing as well. And that's how you do it, by having their handicaps logged in there. And then it's quite a simple way to just keep checking up, and a good way to motivate your crew, as Drew's saying. You need something between the watches that is going to keep people focused. If you can say, well, we know exactly where the competition is, that's quite a useful thing to have. So this is back to the original optimal course screenshot that we looked at. So you've got this one's actually only showing weather. You've got your weather grid in, and the black line is your rum line. That's actually for the Transpac from the US to Hawaii. And you can see the optimal route actually takes them below the rum line at the start of the race, taking into account the weather and the tide that they're going to have at that point. And that's basically how you run an optimal course for an offshore race. And then there's a couple of screenshots here if there are people specifically interested in things like start sequences and that kind of thing. But otherwise, that's basically how you do it.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thank you very much.
I'll just give you an example of this. 2010, I ran couldn't actually get weather during the race with the sound system I've got. I ran a course optimization in the morning before getting on the boat, and it's going 128 miles off the run line. I bottled out at 95 miles off the run. Basically, it had us because my boat has been known to surge, but it was a very big wave, but otherwise there's no surfing happens. So it was just dodge the current was the game plan. Okay, we won our division. Can't be too bad. I've never been that far off the run line on any boat ever. We're 95 miles off. It's kind of cooler.
And we'd have actually probably saved time if we'd actually followed it further.
Yes, yeah. It can be a little bit scary with expeditions sometimes, particularly if you're using it inshore. You can, you've got splits where you're going up to a mark, and if you've plugged in your mark ahead of time, then the navigator can say we've got 10 minutes to take on starboard and 5 minutes to take on port, or something like that. And loads of times I've had people say, oh, it's reading wrong, it's not right, it's not right. So you usually then, like, so long as you're confident you've put your waypoint in the right place, if you start timing it, the number of times that it actually is bang on the money, it's incredible. It is a really good program. I recommend it if you've got time or access and you're able to go and play around with it. It's a really interesting piece of kit.
On the screen that showed optimal boat speed, there was a tab that said heel. Was that heel angle for optimal speed? Or?
Yes, that's right, yes. So, we go right back to the beginning. There was a number of boxes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so heel's here. But if you keep going back a little bit further. So, one more. Yeah, so here. I don't know if they've actually got heel up, but it's actually one of the options here. So you have polars for heel, and so for instance, if you're going upwind and it's very light winds, you want to reduce your wetted surface area of the boat, increase speed going upwind. You've got heel polars, and it is actually one of the ones that people don't really update that often, but it is worth doing. You can have your percentage heel or your heel target displayed in one of the boxes here, so you know we're only doing 30% of heel, we need to get more crew weight down. And it's a really underused element of sail trim, actually. Not very many people know that the navigator actually has that resource at their fingertips.
The Curve 40, for example, has rudder angle polars.
Yes.
What wind speed, how much rudder angle can have? You can go a long way with this if you want to.
Yeah, you can. That's the thing, the number of functions. You sort of just have to sit down with a bit of time or in a small group, and then you can go through the program, and as Simon says, you discover that you can get heel angle or, rudder angle.
I think on that note as well, if you are interested in learning a bit more, then do email me, and then we can try and set something else up, like a classroom session or something.
Yeah.
And go, because this is. I told Lauren to keep it brief because
this
been
kind
here
of
a long
glosses over the whole
time.
area. Sorry for this bit quick.
So if anyone wants an expedition lecture, Gilty's the expert.
Yeah.
And next time Gilty's up in Hong Kong, we can arrange one here if people want to see it. We did one a couple of years ago with it.
Yeah, he's really good. Gilty's amazing.
Gilty's been using the expedition since version 2, which is now at version 8.6.
Yeah.
He's got a lot of experience.
It is also one of those programs that if you pick it up once every 6 months, you will not remember how to use it. If you do it on a sort of weekly basis, you could be great like Gilty, but if you just try and dip into it a couple of times a year, it's really damn difficult. So I think that's why people get a little bit scared off by navigation sometimes, because they just don't use it often enough, and then someone goes, oh here, you navigate, and hands the computer to them. Of course people aren't going to be able to do it, but if your boat has got one of these on the way back in from a race or something like that, just ask the navigator or the tactician, can I have a play? You can't do any terminal damage on these things, to be honest, so you can play around, change the settings and see what's possible.
Could you just go back to the 3 inputs to the course optimization? This one. Just a point here. You can buy from US Sailing a polar for almost every boat in the world because of the old IMS rule, the ORR rule, which is used in the US, and they've got about 5,000 boat numbers. They charge you $400 in the US, whatever it's the time, but they give it to you, and it's already in expedition format, so you don't have to retow it. Got to fiddle with it a little bit, but those polars they have are based upon the best sail for the boat they measured for this angle of wind. So you don't have to necessarily spend the time building the specific information with your sail inventory. You do if you're a Curve 40, let's get this right, but if it's more of a cruisy pig, you don't need to go that far. There will be a point in the polar where the polar jumps from assuming an upwind sail to a downwind sail, but that's already in the polar files you get. So you don't have to build and sail inventory. Obviously it's better if you do, it's more accurate. But you can use it without any sail inventory entered into it. And it will give you good routing information offshore. Obviously it's less useful on a shorter race.
Yeah, I don't think there are that many navigators actually that go home on a Sunday night and analyse their whole log file of all the data that they've collected since
Jamie
9 o'clock.
McCoy.
Jamie.
Every race.
Yeah.
Anthony Root. Yeah.
But most people don't. It's the pros are doing that, definitely. The serious race teams are doing it, absolutely. But as Simon says, you could just rock up on a Sunday with the polos that you bought and you'd probably do pretty well with them. So.
Lots of places you can buy polos.
Yeah.
You can even leave the ones which you get from manufacturer. What I will say about polos is 100% of polos are incorrect. There isn't a correct one in the world. Your boat has got different size sails, it's got a different hull finish, it's got a different pop mark in the bow where you hit that log in the water than the boat next door. All the polos can be slightly different. So if you're famously doing better than your polos, it's because your polos are wrong, or your wind meter is under, your anemometer at the top of the mast is hugely under reading. Two indicators of you sailing better than your polos is to get to 100% of your polar boat speed means that you are America's Cup class trimmer and driver on board.
As Simon says, I think it's also worth constantly recalibrating your boat. If you've got a good electronic system, you're running B&G or Nexus or any sort of comprehensive package on board for your instruments, just keep recalibrating them, because and then adjust your polos as well based on the results that you see, because there's no hard and fast rule to it. It's an art, not a science.
Thank you very much.
Great. All right, thank you.